You know, there was a bill passed recently, and they were emphasizing those individuals who are protected by the Secret Service. You know, I did not accept protection from the Secret Service. And I cannot say that I predicted that there would be a scandal in the Secret Service, but it was not hard to predict that government agencies have a tendency to self-destruct, and this is just another example. People in politics think they're very special. They don't think of themselves as average people. So there's a law that the politicians passed that said that anybody who gets within a certain distance of an individual who's protected by the Secret Service can be arrested for demonstrating, even if it's just holding a sign up, and they can get 10 years for that. You know, there's a statistic out that shows that we have 5% of the population of the world, and we have 25% of the world's prisoners. So what does that mean? Does that mean the Americans are bad people? Or does it mean that we have way too many nonsensical laws on the books? January 1st of this year, the same day that the National Defense Authorization Act came into effect, there were 40,000 other new laws placed on the American people. I don't think we needed, if there were any of those necessary, I haven't discovered them yet, but I would like to be our first president that would actually eliminate 40,000 laws. And of course, there's some that would hit the list. To start off with, the president could do that. They can use the executive order, not to pass new legislation. I think it's wrong. It's not authorized for the president to legislate with executive orders, but it would be proper for a constitutional president to use an executive order to repeal the executive orders that did illegal legislation. There's the Defense Appropriation Act. It has a new name now, but it was an act that was passed in 1950. It essentially gives a president the power to socialize and control all of industry, all finances and all businesses. It's total control. They never invoked it, but I just wonder what's going on, because this time it wasn't passed by the Congress to renew it. It was passed by an executive order. And there were a few changes. The most significant change that was made by the executive branch was it wasn't in times of war that they could execute these powers, but in times of peace as well. Those kind of things are on the books now. And because they're on the books and they're not knocking on our doors and doing things doesn't mean that we should ignore it. Matter of fact, we shouldn't ignore it. We should not be complacent. We should know what's going on. We should know what the Defense Authorization Act really means. And that bill actually authorizes the military to arrest American citizens. That repeals the concept of posse comitatus, but it's not only the arresting of American citizens that's so bad about that. It explicitly says if you're arrested under those conditions, they can prevent you from getting an attorney. It also says that you can be put in prison indefinitely in a secret prison. And they call that part of America. If we're going to have a republic, if we're going to have a return of freedom in this country, that stuff needs repealed and taken off the books. It's been the law because of an executive order, that the president can decide on certain circumstances to assassinate American citizens. They were complaining the other day about the president overstepping his bounds and lecturing the Supreme Court. I'll tell you what, that was rather minor compared to him declaring himself the prosecutor, the judge, and the executioner just on his own. So these kind of changes, of course, they haven't been used that much, just on a few occasions, but it's the precedent that counts. And the other argument is, well, these are bad guys, but they've never been charged with it, and they were never given a trial. You don't know that. But precisely if they were bad people, they deserve a trial for our benefit. Was able to be tried. I think that anybody should be able to be tried. What about the war criminals after World War II? They were at least given a trial. Adolf Eichmann, years later, was arrested and taken to Israel. He was given a trial. But this idea that there's enough power because they so-called a bad person is something that has to be reversed. We cannot ignore it. I'm always delighted with the crowds that come out are very numerous, and you know about it. So that means this information is not being kept secret. It is out in the open, and that, once again, emphasizes the fact why we have to keep the internet free and that we have access to it. Civil liberties, although he claimed he would be. The Congress has not been defending our civil liberties. They passed, the law to allow these arrests. But also, this week the Supreme Court had a ruling. It was a 5-4 ruling that said that anyone who has been approached by a police officer can be strip searched without probable cause. So there are a couple things that that symbolically at least, that has to be changed, is one, the symbolism that we see on television and all the pictures of what happens at the airport and the groping of the TSA agents and the x-rays. If we put up with that and not say no more, there's something wrong with us if we tolerate it. Civil liberties have been going on for a long time. They've got much worse in the last 10 years, especially since 9/11. It was shortly after 9/11. Understandably, we were all very, very concerned about what was happening. But I don't think the analysis was very good. It was considered almost treasonous to suggest that maybe 9/11 had something to do with a phenomenon described by the CIA and the Defense Department, the thing called blowback. Maybe that had something to do with it. Instead of addressing the problems that we have with our foreign policy and see the connection, the attack and the correction has been the attack on the American people. So the first bill that passed after 9/11 was the Patriot Act. So that too should be high on our list for repealing legislation. When that bill was being passed, I remember it clearly because I was sitting on the House floor talking to another member. There weren't very many of us that voted against it. So he was obviously voting for it, and I said, why are you voting for this? And he says, I said, you probably haven't even read it because it only been out on the floor about an hour or so. He said, oh no, I haven't read it. And I said, it'll probably have all of that stuff in it. He said, yeah, I know that too. And I said, why are you going to vote for it? He said, because it's called the Patriot Act. He says, how can I vote against the Patriot Act under these conditions? What would I tell my people back home? I said, well, that's your job. You go home and explain it to them why you need to vote no. But I'm sure you're aware of the fact that if you see the title of a bill going through the Congress, it probably has a title that is exactly opposite of what it's going to do. So, if the bill had said repeal the Fourth Amendment, maybe they wouldn't have gotten so many votes for that. So, next year or so, when we have that chance, the bill will say restore the Fourth Amendment Act and repeal the Patriot Act. There's been a systematic attack on our liberties. One is that, and one that none of us like to admit, it's not our fault. We've been careless. We've been apathetic and lackadaisical about it, and they do these things that we don't hear about it, and they've gotten away with it. That is what I think is changing. I don't find people like you in an audience like this as being lackadaisical when it comes to protecting freedom, and that's the good matter. But certainly, the one item that we have been pursuing now, essentially since the early 70s, has to do with the enforcement of drug laws. And that has led to a couple things. First, we spent a lot of money, probably $3 to $4 trillion. Second, it hasn't done any good whatsoever. Matter of fact, I think that war on drugs is more dangerous than the drugs themselves. Killed over drug wars over the last 5 years or so. So it is very, very dangerous. But it's dangerous to our liberties. It's these SWAT team operations, dozens and dozens. They claim every single day around the country at all levels of government. And it's always to do good, to make people behave and make sure that they don't hurt themselves. At the same time, they're destroying our liberties and undermining and not solving their problems. Drug usage hasn't been solved. The problem with drug usage, matter of fact, drug addiction is much worse with prescription drugs than it is with the illegal drugs. I'm sure you've heard the many stories of SWAT teams barge in and break the doors down. Lo and behold, sometimes they go into the wrong apartment, and sometimes they kill innocent people, and sometimes they destroy property. And yet, we're supposed to accept that? I say no. We shouldn't accept that. We should accept only the protection of our liberties from our government. That is what we should be doing. Another downside on the enforcement of the drug laws is that I consider this one area where there's still a lot of discrimination in this country. There's a lot of talk about the race wars going on and the fighting and the squirming around. But sometimes I think they miss the point where real discrimination occurs. And I believe it's the enforcement of the drug laws. I believe if you're poor and a minority, you're more likely to be arrested and imprisoned and fined and penalized compared to if you happen to be a celebrity and you have money and you're of a different color, you have a different way of getting around the system. One of my daydreams have been, and I think it's still possible it's going to happen, is just like in the 1930s, the early 1930s, the country woke up and said, you know, this prohibition of alcohol is for the birds. Let's repeal prohibition. And that, of course, is what we should do. But the point about drugs is it's a bigger point than just the drug issue. It's about liberty. Who is supposed to be responsible for your safety and you taking care of yourselves and what habits you have? Now, if you use drugs or alcohol, obviously if you do harm to others, you need to be penalized. You need to be in prison or whatever. But if somebody is using drugs and the government comes in and causes all this harm, this is a different problem.